It's a custom to offer reflections of gratitude for a Buddhist teacher on the 100-day commemoration of their death. May 1st marked this continuation for the Most Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, or Thai, which means teacher, and this is my belated offering of gratitude. In the early 2000s, I was a pastor in rural Missouri. In addition to the familiar challenges, our communities were reeling from the emerging methamphetamine crisis. By 2004, Missouri led the nation in meth lab busts, with most of the drugs being produced in home labs. There was a great deal of shame around the problems that went with that, especially addiction and the way people's lives were just falling apart. I remember one woman confidentially asking me for help, looking for support for her granddaughter. She was waiting for me outside my office on a crisp evening in October, and we cried together as she told their story, the wind stinging our faces as evening fell. I shared as many resources as I could, and I recommended some treatment options, but that was too much. She recoiled from me and she stammered, "Nobody can know about this. It would devastate the family." And she wasn't alone. Secrecy was usually the default response, but the shame could only be hidden so long, as our community's needs quickly outpaced the resources available in our little towns. Overwhelmed and uncertain, many people seem to find it more comforting to just avoid the problems than to try to address them, pretending even that the suffering did not exist. My work in the community flew in the face of that avoidance. In hindsight, it was probably not surprising that I found myself increasingly at odds with others in leadership in our church and in our community. One Sunday, the treasurer cornered me in the copy room, and the whir of the Xerox machine buzzed behind us as she emphatically told me that things had to change. "The people you bring to church," she said, "cost more money than they give." We were both very bewildered, and I learned in a new way that cultivating compassion is an ongoing practice and not always as an easy one, even for people who might otherwise be kind. Still, my ongoing work focused on family conflict, abuse and addiction recovery, and spiritual care for marginalized folks in the community continued to be both vitally necessary and surprisingly controversial. We did our best to work together as needs continued to grow, but I could feel my own well-being being stretched thin, and the spiritual disciplines that had sustained me throughout my whole life to that time just weren't adequate anymore. The most pressing question was increasingly becoming, how can I practice in a way that I can engage with suffering inside and around me with honesty, openness, compassion, and wisdom without succumbing to apathy, rage, or despair? I felt increasingly frustrated at those who did not support the community programming and decreasingly hopeful that our efforts were ultimately going to make any difference at all. My spouse Holly and I were foster parents at the time, and we frequently visited a little thrift store in town to pick up household items and toys. And this particular shop was more than a little cluttered, with rows of display shelves loosely organized by type and crowded with old kitchen utensils, hotel-style art, and trash bags overflowing with stuffed animals. It was as if all the odds and ends of the town's garage sales were just unceremoniously dumped into this one single storefront. So it was almost impossible to find anything specific, but you could almost always find something. So we'd give a quick glimpse to see if something useful caught our eyes, and I, of course, had the habit of also checking out the bookshelves too, just in case something of interest had been donated. It was in late 2005 when I happened upon a thin volume on those shelves. It was Being Peace by Thich Nhat Hanh. I was vaguely familiar with the author's name, and the title certainly caught my attention. The back of the book told me that the author was active in peace work and was also a friend of Thomas Merton and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And those were all good signs. But the excerpt spoke directly to my heart. Every day we do things. We are things that have to do with peace. If we are aware of our lifestyle, our way of consuming, our way of looking at things, we will know how to make peace right in the moment we are alive. If we are peaceful, if we are happy, we can smile, and everyone in our family, our entire society, will benefit from our peace. The sticker on the cover assured me that this was a really small risk to be taking, so for 50 cents, I left the thrift store with a hidden gem. Reading Being Peace, I felt myself entirely at home, despite all the chaos and suffering that was going on around me. Thich Nhat Hanh's approach and experience spoke directly to my condition. His expression of engaged Buddhism answered my queries about how to cultivate a spiritual practice that could heal and transform suffering both inside and around me with that honesty, openness, compassion, and wisdom I longed for without succumbing to the apathy, rage, or despair that was always tugging at my heart. There are so many things that make me want to withdraw, to go back to myself, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, but my practice helps me remain in society because I'm aware that if I leave society, I will not be able to help change it. He'd also written with his community the 5 mindfulness trainings and the 14 mindfulness trainings, and those simple ideas and practices became my daily companions. I began a habit of reciting a training each day to help encourage my mind, and it's a practice that I continue even now. Having found Being Peace so helpful, I began listening to talks and reading more books by Thich Nhat Hanh. That was not as easy to do in rural Missouri circa 2005, but I was grateful for whatever resources I could find. One opportunity came during a rare vacation. Knowing how stressful our circumstances were, Holly's parents gifted us with a vacation to Grand Teton National Park, and such a trip inevitably included stops in used bookstores that we happened across. And that's where I picked up a copy of Fragrant Palm Leaves, a collection of Thich Nhat Hanh's journals from 1962 to 1966. Before reading this book, I had only an academic understanding of the role and importance of bodhisattvas in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. Thich Nhat Hanh helped me understand their power and beauty. And there is one bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a symbolic, archetypal divine being who postpones their own entrance into nirvana in order to work to help relieve the suffering of others. And Kashida Garba was one of these bodhisattvas, and his story especially spoke to me with his vow to be with those who are in the places of greatest suffering. His presence made it possible, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, for flowers to bloom even in the depths of hell. Thich Nhat Hanh assured us that, quote, no one sees the existence of suffering more deeply than a bodhisattva, yet no one maintains as refreshing and unwavering a smile. And in reading those words and others like them, my heart, which had been so heavy, so weighed down by the suffering around me, lightened and opened up again. I never met Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh in person. I came close when I was next door to him when he had a retreat in Vietnam and I was working in Cambodia, but we never met face to face. But I have spent a lot of time with him, and his teachings and practices live within me. He had lived a courageous life in the midst of difficult and often terrifying circumstances. He worked to transform conservative religious hierarchy in Vietnam. He engaged in social work in the midst of war. He advocated for peace while he was in exile. He aided fellow refugees fleeing violence. He supported the civil rights movement when he lived in the United States. He did healing work with veterans and survivors, and so much more. For those who only know him for his gentle voice and his meditation instructions, it may be difficult to understand that he was a very controversial figure that was considered dangerous by many people. Yet, even in the face of opposition, he continued his simple, loving practices for decades, meeting new issues with wisdom and compassion. In all of this, Thich Nhat Hanh's life was consistent with the Buddhist understanding that if one person is liberated from suffering, all will be liberated. And if all are liberated, then each one is liberated. Or as Fannie Lou Hamer would teach us, Nobody's free until everybody's free. This aspect of community, even and especially community in the midst of hardship, has figured prominently in my reflections of Thich Nhat Hanh's passing and death. Two familiar texts keep coming to my mind. In the 10 Subjects for Frequent Recollection, it's a common chant from the Thai forest tradition. We recite, "Could my spiritual companions find fault with my conduct? This should be reflected upon again and again by one who has gone forth." And from the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the teaching on loving kindness, we remember that the boundless heart is peaceful and calm and wise and skillful, not proud or demanding in nature. Let them not do the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. It's significant that both of these teachings put our lives in the context of community. But getting this right, too, is a practice. In my experience, people, at least in the West, often approach these questions with a rather binary focus on what is right or wrong or what is good or evil, to the neglect of a more relational and reflective approach. When I teach about meditation, for example, the most common question I've received over the years is, "Am I doing this right?" But meditation practice is a relational practice. It's about our relationship with our experiences, our bodies, our hearts and minds, and even with each other and the earth. Am I doing this the right way is usually not a helpful approach to get to those relationships. So we work instead with another set of questions. What happens when I do it this way? Does this lead to more suffering in myself, others, or the earth? If so, then the practice is in letting go. Does this lead to compassion, wisdom, and insight, to more well-being in myself, others, or the earth? If so, then the practice is to encourage and maintain those skillful qualities. We call to mind our human and natural communities, understanding that there is no well-being for me that excludes the well-being of others. Our well-being is connected, and that is what moves us to refrain from doing the slightest thing that the wise would later reprove. When this is the case, our self-restraint is not out of a sense of shame or guilt or self-consciousness, but out of the care that we give to one another. And while varying religious and cultural traditions will all have their own definitions for what makes a person wise, we usually hold in common a sense of trust in those who have demonstrated wisdom and compassion. Hopefully that includes, or will grow to include, ourselves, as our spiritual and reflective practices bear fruit in our own lives. The wise, compassionate heart guides us, and we grow to trust that wisdom, and with it, the ability to notice and let go when there is something unskillful. In contrast, blame and guilt are usually pretty unhelpful. More than that, they're usually inaccurate. They oversimplify the situation and lead to misunderstanding, since our lives are interdependent. Compassion and encouragement and wise action are helpful because they help us make good choices that bear good fruit. We can take responsibility for our unskillful, harmful actions, ask forgiveness, make amends where possible, and begin anew. And we can celebrate what is done well and encourage one another to keep doing well, to be skillful in our practice. We can be compassionate to those in need, even when they are victims of their own consequences. And we can hold out the possibility that life can change in this present moment, in this wonderful moment. In doing so, we practice like a bodhisattva for the liberation and well-being of all. And that's all beautiful and lovely to me. But it's also hard work. It's training the heart and the mind. It's hard work, and it's possible work. A friend and I were talking along these lines recently, reflecting on how if you take care of the practice can take care of you. And if all of us are living in that way, we can also say with confidence, if you take care of the community can take care of you. I'm sure you felt this and also felt that it's easy to restrain ourselves from harmful actions when we're motivated by that kind of care. The boundless heart, we find, knows how to let go. So we ask, could my spiritual companions find fault with my conduct? This should be reflected upon again and again. And we do this again and again because it's practice. By simply calling to mind the memory and presence of those we love, those we share community with, those who care for us, and those we care for, we gain a sense of our shared wisdom and the support we need to stay on the path. I believe this is also one of the most important reasons why people all over the world felt the loss of the Most Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh so strongly. For so many, they encountered the teachings of Venerable Thai at a time in their life when they were hurting or angry or confused, and they learned to trust his gentle presence. That was me, at least. And when the teachings open an awareness of our unskillful, harmful actions of body, speech, and mind, Thich Nhat Hanh did it in such a compassionate way that it brought not guilt, but insight into our well-being and an experience of care. And we have at least glimpsed this in our relationships with each other and our spiritual communities too. And that's what keeps us coming back together. We grow to know and trust that what we can offer one another is this kind of compassionate presence that encourages us to always grow and learn and be better. And that is the art of cultivating community. But anyone who's been involved in this kind of community building, especially when it's in the middle of injustice and oppression, knows that it's hard work. Looking backwards, we can get a glimpse of how uncertain life is, including a lot of things that might otherwise feel inevitable now. It's easy to remember in hindsight that Thich Nhat Hanh was an internationally known teacher and author. He was a founder of monastic and practice communities all around the world. He was an accomplished scholar, a poet, an artist, and an activist who combined all of this into an expression of socially engaged spirituality. But his life was also filled with tender and fragile moments when none of those things were certain to unfold. As when he described the moment when Sister Chan Kung brought him back from the edge of exhaustion and burnout during their efforts to work for peace during the Vietnam War. It was 1966, he shared, when the war in Vietnam had become unbearable, and I was so absorbed in working to end the war, it was hard for me to even swallow my food. Sister Chan Kung was mindfully preparing herbs with noodles in the kitchen. When Thich Nhat Hanh passed through, her simple question was, "Thai, can you help me identify these herbs?" And that question became a bell of mindfulness. And Thich Nhat Hanh, standing in that kitchen, looking at the herbs, getting in touch with them in that moment, allowed him to be able to find his balance again. And beautifully, this was a lesson he never outgrew. He wrote, "Years later, a friend of mine from America asked me, 'Thai, why do you waste your time growing lettuce? Wouldn't it be better to use the time to write poems? Anyone can plant lettuce, but few people can write such beautiful poetry.' I smiled and said, 'My dear friend, if I do not plant this lettuce, I will not be able to write poetry.'" That was the message I needed to hear when I was exhausted by the suffering in my community, and I stumbled upon that little paperback in 2005. I'd studied Buddhism academically for years, but Thich Nhat Hanh opened the door of practice to me. I'm grateful for all the wonderful teachers I've had since then. I've studied a lot, and I've practiced even more. But looking back, I see that I have never outgrown the wisdom I first encountered in the teachings and example of the Most Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh. With gratitude, I listen again to the words I first read in that little thrift store in rural Missouri. Every day we do things. We are things that have to do with peace. If we're aware of our lifestyle, our way of consuming, our way of looking at things, we will know how to make peace right in the moment we are alive. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.